if we talk about in terms of, let's just say everything comes up Goldilocks for Bitcoin and we continue to see risk on and we continue to see money printing, which obviously makes Bitcoin an even rarer commodity out there. I think what you have to start to do is you have to start looking at the all-time highs at 69,000. And I would dare say that you probably are even looking at 100,000. Again, the more money in the system, people have more money to put towards Bitcoin. And I think that, you know, the government, I don't know if they're discounting people's kind of observance of what's going on, or if the politics just don't even allow for it. But at some point, people are going to turn and say, listen, the dollar at some point becomes a depreciating, well, it is a depreciating asset even now, but even more so at a breakneck speed. And that's where Bitcoin can really take off to the upside.
Gareth Soloway, a well-known technical analyst, investor, and trader in the cryptocurrency space, has gained notoriety for his often controversial views and predictions regarding Bitcoin. While generally bullish on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in the long term, his short-term forecasts for the leading digital asset have been less optimistic. Since late 2021, Soloway has been forecasting a significant decline in Bitcoin's price, with predictions ranging from as low as $3,500 per coin to potential highs of $122,000 or lows of $9,000, depending on various economic factors. However, in a recent interview with Kitco News, Soloway offered a more nuanced outlook for Bitcoin, taking into account the recent approval of spot Bitcoin ETFs and increased institutional investment. While he maintains a bearish stance on Bitcoin, particularly if the U.S. economy faces a severe recession and the stock market falters, he also acknowledges the potential for bullish scenarios. Soloway explains that if the Federal Reserve successfully manages to control inflation without plunging the economy into recession, Bitcoin could soar to new heights, easily surpassing its current all-time high and reaching $100,000. Soloway's interview with Kitco News provides insight into his multifaceted perspective on Bitcoin's future, showcasing both his cautious optimism and his concerns regarding macroeconomic conditions in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a look at the chart here, and I think this is really telling and makes people understand what really went on. And so if we just look at the history, and I'm a technician, meaning I look at data sets to kind of predict the future, and that's really how I come to these conclusions. So if we go back to the 2017 Bitcoin bull market high, that was when the futures were approved, right? They basically debuted. So there was a lot of hype that took us up into that news. And then what happened? That was the high of the cycle. If we go to the first high in 2021, that was the IPO of Coinbase that debuted, and that marked that high. We had a correction to 30,000. We then go to the second high later in 2021, and that was the ETF for the futures, Bitcoin, right? And that marked that high as well. And so if you just look at that kind of consistency, that these big news stories that create so much hype create the top on Bitcoin, it makes sense why that would be the key level there, or why it would sell off on the news. Now, you can talk about GBTC, obviously right, selling Bitcoin. There was a lot of smart money that bought ahead of this news. GBTC was trading at a big discount, so it was kind of an extra bonus to them as well. And they're basically just at the point of taking profits. They know the run-up is now in play. They know that the general consensus of retail investors will be to take a little bit off the table. And that just creates this back testing, this move back to the downside. Now, just in terms of the 48 to 50,000 level, what's fascinating here is if we do a Fibonacci retrace, right? So we take the high of 69,000, the low to the absolute low of this bear market here, which was around 15,000 and change. Notice that the 618 Fibonacci trend line here, that's exactly the high there. And lastly, I'm just showing you how I kind of arrived at that 48 to 50,000 level. If we take the 2019 high, connect it through the lows of the bull market right here, we actually get that same level. And so when I get confluence of levels, that's really where I start to say, okay, this is going to be a major level of resistance. And sure enough, it was. Yeah, so what's going on here is, and you're right about the fees, right? GBTC is a much higher fee, so there's going to be a certain amount of money that is going to sell the GBTC and then eventually rotate into these other ETFs that have much, much lower fees. And I also think there was just, I mean, really, if you looked at how could you participate in your investment account at various brokers where you buy stocks, the only game in town was GBTC at the time, right? I mean, that's really all there was. It was either that or you go to the futures market or you go to Bitcoin itself on the spot market. So there was a lot of money that chased Bitcoin in, knowing that it would run up into the ETF approval. And it's just natural that you get this letdown where people say, okay, let me take some off the table here. Let me take my profits after such a mammoth run. So it's a combination of the two. You have the selling because of the fee factor and also just profit taking in general, which again, you can go to any asset class and you see these crazy runs. There's going to be a certain certain amount of profit taking that takes place.
JP Morgan analysts recently released a market strategy note discussing the impact of Bitcoin ETFs. According to their analysis, the outflows from the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust have likely ceased, indicating limited downside potential for Bitcoin prices moving forward. Initially estimating around $3 billion in outflows as investors took profits, the actual figure reached approximately $4.4 billion by Wednesday. However, the analysts now believe that the outflows have stabilized, paving the way for a swift recovery in Bitcoin prices. Indeed, Bitcoin has already shown signs of recovery, with its price surging above $41,000 for the first time since Monday. As of the latest data from CoinMarketCap, the leading cryptocurrency is up by over 3%. This upward momentum suggests that the recovery phase is underway, signaling a positive trajectory for Bitcoin moving forward. As we delve into Gareth Soloway's interview, it's evident that the market sentiment is shifting towards a more optimistic outlook for Bitcoin, fueled in part by the stabilization of GBTC outflows.
Should be sooner than later. I do think that within probably the next couple of weeks, it will balance out. My bigger fear, though, and this is the one bearish case that I have for Bitcoin, is that what happens if we get a market top in the S&P? What happens if we get a de-risking event in the overall markets, in the equity markets? And that then could also stall money from flowing into these new ETFs if people start to get scared. So right now, we know new all-time highs almost daily on the S&P and the NASDAQ 100, and that's great. But why is Bitcoin stalling out here? Okay, it's the GBTC selling of Bitcoin. That gives us that reasoning. But what, again, if we start to see the market sell off? And the one thing I'd like to point out to viewers here, which I think is really important, is that if you look at the past cycles on Bitcoin, so Bitcoin's topped out in December of 2017, the S&P topped out 6 weeks later in early 2018. If you go to 2021, the $69,000 high, the high was put in November. It was right at the end of December, 6 weeks later, that the S&P topped out. So I'm a little bit on alert here to say, okay, let's watch now 3 weeks. We're basically 3 weeks into since the spot ETF was approved. What happens over the next 3+ weeks? Do we see a stock market top, and do we see a correction there? And that would be another reason why you could argue that Bitcoin still has some downside to go.
If we continue to see equity markets rally, does Bitcoin catch up?
Yeah. So I think so. I think if we continue, if we just continue to grind higher in the S&P and the NASDAQ, eventually the risk on trade takes back over, absorbs all the GBTC selling pressure, and ultimately pushes Bitcoin back up. So it's really the one case where Bitcoin could sell off is only if we see an equity market top. Now, if we direct our attention to my charts here, I just want to show you guys this because to me, all the narrative is in the mainstream media is that the markets are just gangbusters. Everything's just going higher. If we look at this is all the sectors in the S&P 500. And if we look going back to 2020 or 2019, if you look at all the other sectors except technology, we've basically gone sideways. There hasn't been much net gain. But if you look at technology, this has been just a rocket ship to the upside. And that has carried the entire S&P, the entire NASDAQ to new all-time highs. And I do think that puts it in perspective of asking, okay, is this really a broad-based rally, or is this somewhat of a fluke where technology is just controlling the markets? And this type of chart makes me a little bit cautious going into the next few weeks to months. In the near term, if it pulls back to 30 to 32, I'm a buyer at that level. Now, what I will say, and you asked me, well, what's the scenario where we get to 15,000? If you really saw a bad recession hit, and again, we know that there's so many negatives out there, but so far, to be honest, government spending is just insatiably filling those holes, right? We've seen the Fed, and this is an interesting stat, we've seen the Fed balance sheet drop by a whole $1.5 trillion from $9 trillion to about $7.5 trillion. The U.S. national debt in that same amount of time has gone up to $4 trillion. And so you have to understand is that the Fed has supposedly been tightening monetary policy, but instead the government has been spending at crazy breakneck speeds that has overcompensated. And that explains a lot of why the overall equity markets continue to push up. But at some point that breaks. And at some point we will slip into a recession. At some point the Fed can't avoid it. And that's where I do worry that Bitcoin could head back down. So we talk about in terms of, let's just say everything comes up Goldilocks for Bitcoin and we continue to see risk on and we continue to see money printing, which obviously makes Bitcoin an even rarer commodity out there. I think what you have to start to do is you have to start looking at the all-time highs at 69,000. And I would dare say that you probably are even looking at 100,000. Now, I still don't think that's the likely scenario here here in the short term. But I do think that if everything continues as is with no recession, no risk off, then yeah, you're going to head back there. And it'll just be a matter of time before that bid comes back in. Again, the more money in the system, people have more money to put towards Bitcoin. And I think that, you know, the government, I don't know if they're discounting people's kind of observance of what's going on, or if the politics just don't even allow for it. But at some point, people are going to turn and say, listen, the dollar at some point becomes a depreciating, well, it is a depreciating asset even now, but even more so at a breakneck speed. And that's where Bitcoin can really take off to.
Contrary to his typically bleak and pessimistic forecasts, Soloway has been offering a notable shift towards optimism, particularly since the approval of ETFs. He firmly believes that these ETFs will see widespread adoption by hundreds, if not thousands, of affluent investors who now have ample exposure to the leading cryptocurrency. Soloway emphasizes the potential for Bitcoin's price to surge exponentially as more individuals recognize the inherent flaws in the current monetary system. Examining both sides of the issue is crucial for making well-informed decisions. What are your thoughts on Soloway's interview? Feel free to share your comments and observations in the section below. For more daily dose crypto news, check out these 2 awesome videos on your screen. Click now and we will see you on the next video.